All right, so we're going to talk about the modern civil rights movement. It's post World War II to about 1968, maybe 1970, that kind of thing. Well, the civil rights movement, it had been there going on since, well before the Civil War, with the abolitionist movement. Then it continues after Reconstruction. You have people pushing for voting rights, ending the poll tax, ending the literacy test. People like W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, those figures of the early civil rights movement. Well, after World War II, we see a big push for civil rights. There's two major reasons that we have this. One, we have soldiers returning from World War II. Okay, the soldiers returning from World War II, they push for a change because they've seen something different than what we have here. The second thing, and I think is almost more important, is we have a new communication medium that can influence people more than any we've had before. What's the new communications that we have during the 1950s that comes up? That all of us probably have multiple of these sitting in our home. It's the television, right? Television. It's a lot different listening to something or reading about something than literally seeing it unfold in front of you, right? Okay? The television, the media is going to be a huge, huge influence on the modern civil rights movement. Okay, so let's look at the goals of the civil rights movement because we just need to know these. Modern civil rights movement. Okay, the goals of this movement. Okay? Number one. Now, these go back to what the NAACP has been asking for a long time. Number one, they want to end the poll tax. Now, what is the poll tax? What is it? Okay, a tax at the polls. Okay. It's literally a tax you had to pay to be able to vote. I know the law that was in Mississippi. You had to pay a tax annually in the state of Mississippi to be able to vote. Now, that money was actually used to pay the people who worked at the election. Okay, they do pay people. In fact, when you turn 18, you can be a poll worker. It's a one-day gig, and I think they pay you $8 an hour to do it. It's a 12-hour job. So if you don't have a job, if you're 18, you're out of school that day anyway, it's something you could sign up for, and you could see the process. But that's what the poll tax was originally for. However, the problem with the poll tax is, does everybody have money to pay this tax? To be able to exercise a right, a guaranteed right by the Constitution. It doesn't. Well, I'll tell you what it was in Mississippi when they outlawed the poll tax. It was $2 a year. I know, $2. That's not much today, right? Okay. Well, at that time, minimum wage wasn't $1 yet. I think minimum wage was about 75 cents. Okay. Which, okay, whoop-de-doo. I worked 2.5 hours and I got my poll tax paid, right? Except if you're making minimum wage, you got to pay groceries, you got to pay rent, you got to keep the lights on, keep the heat on, all that kind of stuff. Is poll tax is your voting right? Paying for your vote, paying to be able to vote, is that the top priority? No, feeding your family is, right? Also, particularly in the South, there was a large section, particularly of the poor population. There were a lot of African Americans. There were also a lot of whites that were in this situation. It was called sharecropping. And we talked about sharecropping back in Unit 1. Okay, sharecropping, basically people work on somebody's land. They pay the rent essentially in giving them a share of the crop that they harvest. Okay, seems like a fairly simple system. Okay, there's no cash involved in that until the crop is harvested, right? So for that year, while the crop's growing, the sharecroppers actually have to purchase food and such on credit. Okay, so what happens if the crop fails? They're in debt, right? Now the landowner's going to keep extending them credit because that's keeping the crops being grown on their farm, right? But they don't have cash. So the poor people, particularly, were hurt by this, particularly those sharecroppers, because there's not cash moving around. So this disenfranchised a large section of the population in the South. Okay. Now the poll tax was not put in place in every state in the Union. I think if it had been in every state in the Union, it would not have been as big a deal. But what states do you think had the poll tax? The southern states. And this was a vehicle to disenfranchise people. Now, it does affect all the poor people, right? But there is something we know that sort of gave the poor whites, if they could prove that they had family that voted in a certain election, that they could be exempted from the poll tax. Now, that's not fair, is it? Okay. Even what if you were an immigrant afterward? That disenfranchised you. Okay. So if the grandfather clause hadn't have been there, then it would not have been as discriminatory towards a particular race. It would have just discriminated against poor people. Still discriminatory, but not the same thing. But that was one of the goals, to get rid of the poll tax. The second thing was a lot harder to do. Indiscrimination. Okay. Now, obviously, ending discrimination, they're particularly focusing on segregation. And not just any kind of segregation, but de jure segregation. Remember, de jure segregation is segregation by law. Okay? So here we're mainly focused on de jure segregation. Okay? So that's segregation by law. De jure, a good example is Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow laws, I want you to understand, Jim Crow laws don't have anything to do with voting rights. These are only segregation. That would be where we have a white school and a colored school. A white water fountain, a colored water fountain. Okay? A white library, a colored library. Y'all know how Memphis handled that? Anybody know? Did we have white libraries and black libraries? No, they did not do that, which a lot of people don't know this. Did you know that they had Black Day to attend stuff in Memphis? Well, every other day there was only one Black Day. So, but segregation, the way they handle that, particularly things like the zoo. Okay, the zoo. Everybody's been to the Memphis Zoo. Everybody's gone to see those pandas. You know, those are the most boring animals ever. But anyway, you've been to see the pandas. All right. Well, the zoo, the way they handled de jure segregation in Memphis to make sure there was segregation, Tuesdays were black-only days. Every other day of the week. Now, Tuesday, what if I got a job? Can I take my kid to the zoo on Tuesday? No. So, see, it's still discriminatory. But the Pink Palace, any of the museums that you had to pay to go into, they were reserved for the African-American population of Memphis on Tuesdays. That's how they handled that. Some cities had separate libraries, that kind of thing, but Memphis didn't. I just thought that y'all might want to know that. All right. So the second one's indiscrimination. That was going to be a hard one, but we're really focusing on segregation by law. The third thing was to enact federal anti-lynching laws. Okay, now when we say lynching, a lot of people thinking that's just a hanging. A lynching is any kind of mob murder. Probably one of the most famous lynchings in American history was not a hanging. Anybody heard of Emmett Till before? I'm sure in Mississippi Studies you probably talked about Emmett Till, particularly if you had Miss Rogers.
Did she lie on him? Did she lie?
Oh, you mean the lady?
Yeah, she lied.
Yes. I was thinking, how did Miss Rogers lie? Anyway, so basically Emmett Till, he was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, came down to visit his great uncle. Actually, that's something that a lot of times in the big cities during this time people would do, is once the kids got out of school, they would send them to a relative's farm to help them for the summer, that kind of thing. And Emmett's mom was a single mom, so she was working all the time. She sent him down to keep him out of trouble. Well, that didn't work, did it? But she sent him down, and basically on a dare, it appears that it was a dare from what I've read, he was dared to talk to a white store clerk. And essentially, there's conflicting things that were said about this, but what his cousin said, and that's the one who did the dare, said that he said, "Bye, baby," to her when she gave him his change when he was buying his little candy. And then whistled like a wolf. They call it a wolf whistle, like a, something like that. In other words, looking good, something like that. And that caused such an uproar that her husband and her brother came and got Emmett Till that night. And essentially they beat him and then shot him and tied a cotton gin fan around his neck and threw him in the Tallahatchie River, where he was found 5 days later. There's additional parts to the story. Allegedly, there's a third person that was involved that was not tried for this. These guys were found not guilty of this. It was a huge deal. Emmett Till, he actually furthered the civil rights movement because do y'all remember what his mama did? Open casket in Chicago. Okay, open casket. Now his body had been in the river for 5 days. Okay, hey, he had been beaten to a pulp before he was shot. But think about what that body looked like. Okay, but she said she wanted the world to see what they did to her baby boy, and the world did. Over 150,000 people came to the visitation, the wake in the church in Chicago. Jet Magazine published that photo in its issue. Okay, now it was sort of eye-opening for the rest of the world. There had been rumblings that lynchings happened and that kind of thing, but again, if we hear something, it's easy to sort of say that kind of thing doesn't happen, right? It's easy for us to look over something, but now we saw evidence that had happened, and this really gets a lot of people involved in the civil rights movement. So, federal anti-lynching laws, those don't become a reality for a long, long time. Have y'all heard of the hate crime laws? Have y'all heard of that? Essentially, that's what an anti-lynching law is. Okay. However, the lynching is actually a murder. Okay, but hate crimes, that's kind of an extension of that. Okay. So these were the main goals of civil rights, and we're going to focus today. I want you to see it's voting rights and ending discrimination. Those are the two main goals, and they're going to work on that, and they do strengthen that up as time goes on. But we're going to focus on these two to start, okay? And really, we're going to start in the 1950s. Probably the watershed moment of the civil rights movement in the 1950s happened in 1954. Wow, that's a stinky marker. Let's switch. Okay, 1954. So let's just say it's a timeline of civil rights. Now, this was a court case we talked about. What happened in 1954? What court case? Actually, it's why we're all sitting here in the same room together. Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. Right? Okay. What that did was it outlawed school segregation in public schools. Okay. So 1954, we got Brown v. Board. Okay. So that one, we've already talked about it, so I'm not gonna go through it again. Just know it outlawed school segregation. We know that one. That one, you probably knew that one before you even got in this class. Okay. Brown versus Board of Education. Oh, Keegan did make it. All right.
Mr. Gardner, bright in your class.
It's too bright in my class? It helps us wake up. I got you. All right, so 1954, that's Brown versus Board of Education. That just made everything right just there, didn't it? No, the Supreme Court passed the Supreme Court law and or a Supreme Court order. The states took their time enacting that, okay? We don't end up with full school integration in the state of Mississippi until 1971, okay? That's a lot of years later. Now, DeSoto County, we went earlier than that. But Brown versus Board of Education, that's a watershed moment. Now, 1955, there's a couple of big things. We just talked about Emmett Till. Emmett Till got killed in 1955, okay? And did anybody have to read the book Mississippi Murder Trial 1955? It's based on it's a fictionalized book based on Emmett Till, and it's actually written, I think, for like middle school age. So I know some students read that. Okay.
So they ain't do nothing to the brothers?
Well, here's the crazy thing, and this is the craziest thing. Well, they had a trial. Okay, and they were convicted. They were not guilty. Okay, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution tells us that you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. Okay, in other words, if there is a verdict in a case, either guilty or not guilty, you can't be tried for that exact same crime. Okay, well, they were found not guilty, so there was a verdict of not guilty. That means they cannot be tried for murder of Emmett Till again. Okay. And so what that meant was they were safe. 2 months after that case was over, they got interviewed by Look magazine. Now, Look magazine would be like People magazine or Entertainment Weekly, one of those things that people buy at the grocery store every week, okay? It was the sort of the most popular magazine at that time. Anybody ever seen A Christmas Story, the Red Ryder BB gun movie? His mom reads Look magazine. He stuck the little ad in there, okay? But Look magazine, so this was a very well-read publication at that time, okay? They were interviewed, and the interviewer literally asked them all these questions, but one of them, did you kill Emmett Till? They said yes, and they explained how they did it, word for word. They can't be tried for this case again. They admitted to murder. All right. Guess what that helps? That helps build this civil rights movement too. Okay. They admitted it, but nothing can be done about it. Kind of like O.J. Simpson. We all pretty well know that he, more than likely, was the person who killed his ex-wife and her little boyfriend. Okay. But he was found not guilty in that situation. He even wrote a book later that told us how he would have done it.
Yeah, why he got arrested?
Okay. Well, no, later on he got arrested for armed robbery. So, he had sold some of his, some of his memorabilia from his days playing football, and he wanted it back. But anyway, it's the same thing. They can't ever try him for that murder again. So this thing, that was a horrible situation. Okay, but that's again eye-opening to people in other parts of the country. You got to understand, the South, it was a fairly closed society as far as, oh, no, it's not, people always can kind of sugarcoat what was going on. But here, that showed the nation, not just the nation, but the world, what was going on in the South, particularly in Mississippi. Mississippi, by the way, we get a very negative reputation that we still hold today because of these events back then, okay? So does the state of Alabama, although Alabama had a little bit worse stuff going on there than we did. Okay.
There was a movie about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Double Jeopardy. That's exactly what it's called, is Double Jeopardy. Yeah. All right, 1955, there were several things. Emmett Till, that was a big thing, but there was a bigger thing in the media. Sadly, the Emmett Till case, it kind of, just like anything, it just kind of, wow, everybody was really interested, and then people moved on. Other things were in their mind. Well, the other thing that occurred in 1955 was the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay, the key figure of this, the person that y'all immediately think of when I say bus boycott, is who? What lady?
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. Some of you may have been to the Civil Rights Museum and sat on that bus next to her statue, right? Okay, we've been there. When I take students to Civil Rights Museum, we always get the picture. We got to sit by Rosa, right? Okay. Now the thing is, and what a lot of people don't realize is, Rosa Parks, that was a planned situation. Okay, she wasn't the first person to do this. Actually, there was a pregnant lady in New Orleans that got arrested for the same thing. However, they didn't think that was a good case to pursue, because she wasn't married, but she was pregnant. So she was of questionable reputation. Rosa Parks, she was a middle-aged lady. She had been married for quite a few years. She worked as a seamstress, but she had also been a secretary for the local office of the NAACP. Okay? They backed her case because she could be found without repute. Okay? In other words, nobody could really say something bad about Rosa Parks. Okay, she wasn't out carousing, she wasn't out drinking and going to the clubs and stuff like that. She was a middle-aged lady and from a stable job, stable marriage, all that kind of stuff. She becomes a poster child, doesn't she? Really, she becomes the focus. This woman, this middle-aged woman who'd been at work all day, is told to give up her seat merely because she was born with darker pigmented skin than somebody else. Okay. This is the case. Now, Basically, the Supreme Court previously had ruled on bus segregation, but they could only control it on interstate buses. Actually, back in 1948, there had been a court case called Morgan versus Virginia that outlawed segregation on interstate buses and interstate bus facilities. So like a waiting room, if you're waiting to go on an interstate bus, those waiting rooms were supposed to be integrated, and interstate buses were too. But this was a city bus that is governed by the city of Montgomery, Alabama. Okay? Well, what they decide, we've got Rosa Parks. I assume y'all all have heard the story of Rosa Parks, that she had to, was forced to give up her seat and move to the back of the bus, right? Y'all all know that, so we're not going to go into that. She was arrested. Y'all have probably all seen the pictures. I'll find the videos and put them up there. There's a great video series called Eyes on the Prize. If ever you get a chance, watch them. There's actually two series. The first one is the best one, and it covers through this. The very first episode in that deals with Emmett Till, and it deals with the Montgomery bus boycott. And it really goes through this. I like that one because it's old enough that it's actually interviewing the people who did this. Okay? Sometimes we don't like to watch older video, right? The quality's not great and all that, but these are the people who did this. So Rosa Parks, we know that. Now, another key figure comes to national prominence because of the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, what's a boycott? What's a boycott?
Going against something.
Basically, a refusal to do something to make a point, right? A boycott. If they're boycotting the buses, what are people not going to do? They're not going to get on the bus. Okay? Now, these are the African Americans. They wanted one day. They wanted a one-day bus boycott because the African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, they made up about 80% of the riders on the buses in that city. Okay? Well, imagine. That hurt that bus company, right? If you got one day where you lost 80% of your profits. Okay, that hurts them in the pocketbook, right? And actually, they weren't hoping for 80%. I mean, that's because some people were just going to have to ride the bus, right? But they did that boycott, that one-day boycott, and this is an example of nonviolent protest, right? We're just not doing something. We're just not going to ride the bus. I'll walk to work that day, okay? And actually, it was really, really interesting how they did it. The African American community, they organized ride-sharing programs. If people had cars, they would loan their car out so people could get to work because people got to work, right? The bus company's like, they'll start riding once they aren't making their money. Well, the African American community and the NAACP, they made sure that everybody was able to get to work, or they walked to work, okay? That first day was such a success, they agreed to let's keep going. Let's see how long we can go, okay? Because no African Americans rode the buses. Those buses were running empty. And when those buses are running empty, guess what? They're losing money. They're losing fuel money. They're paying that driver just to drive in a circle. That's why, as a bus driver, I really enjoy, the last day before Christmas holidays when I just take a little swing through Colonial Hills and then come back. Because they're paying me, right? Even though I don't have any riders. Well, that costs money, doesn't it? Okay? This boycott went on for over a year. How long can that bus company keep going? Running the buses empty.
Not too long.
I mean, they were going bankrupt. That's what it was. And finally, and there was court cases involved and all that kind of stuff. Finally, the city of Montgomery, after a little over a year, they lifted that segregation rule. Okay? The Montgomery bus boycott, I mean, this was nonviolent. There was no violence at all. This was a protest by not doing something. Like we can do boycotts right now. Like I remember back in the 80s, there was a big deal about tuna fish in cans. Okay? You're like, woo, tuna fish. Basically, the people who would catch the tuna, they'd catch dolphins in there too. And the poor dolphins would get killed in the tuna harvest. And dolphins were kind of on the edge of being an endangered species at that point. So there was a gigantic boycott of tuna unless they guaranteed that it was dolphin-free tuna. I mean, people boycott other stuff. Like, I don't know, if a company has a stance that people don't agree with, they don't shop there. Okay, boycotts still happen today. But this was a very pointed boycott in a city, and it was a success. Now, it took them a while to get there. But the leader who becomes super prominent is one everybody can, if I say the name and close your eyes, you can picture this person. It's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a 25-year-old pastor, and he became nationally prominent because of this, because he was the leader. It's important. He was young. Hey, young people are more likely to take the steps than the older folks. They just are. Okay. Also, he was new to town. The people of the city hadn't gotten him under their thumb. Okay, Ashton, do you have a question, buddy?
Oh, nah, it was about the Joker Jeopardy stuff.
Okay, what about it?
It was the movie. It was like she killed her husband, staged and murdered. They blamed her for it, and then when she got out of jail, she killed him in front of the police.
Yeah, I remember that. But that same situation. But he had faked his murder. That's why that would have worked. All right. So, Montgomery bus boycott, really, really important watershed moment. Also, television was very prominent in the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay, and that's one thing. We have so much good footage of this. Okay, moving on, we got 1957. 1957 is the first big test of Brown versus Board of Education. We got the Little Rock 9. Okay, now we talked about them a little bit. In fact, there's a picture right up there on the wall of a young lady named Elizabeth Eckford who had to walk to school on the day that they were integrating the school. Yes, sir.
During the civil rights, we're going to talk about the freedom rights?
Yep, we'll get there. All right. 1957, the Little Rock 9. Essentially, it was a plan for integration of the city of Little Rock schools. And they did this gradual integration across the South, where they would pick sort of the top students from the colored school and gradually integrate them into the white schools. In Little Rock, they picked, originally it was 10, but the one person ended up getting, I think it was like appendicitis or something. I'll have to double check. But they got sick and they weren't able to go. So it ends up being the Little Rock 9. So these 9 students were to integrate the Little Rock Central High School. Little Rock Central High School had about 3,000 students in it. It was a really big school. And it's still a school today. You can go see it over in Little Rock. But these students were supposed to integrate. It was sort of be, kind of small, low-key thing. But the governor of Arkansas at that time was running for re-election. And kind of like, remember Joseph McCarthy with his McCarthyism? He needed a cause so that he could get reelected because he had been an ineffective senator. Orville Faubus, that's his name, Orville Faubus. He was an ineffective governor. Okay, Orville Faubus, he needed a cause, and he picked the cause of we're going to stop integration of schools. The crazy thing is Arkansas was actually the first southern state to integrate its colleges and universities, and they did that right after World War II. So Arkansas up to this point had been a fairly progressive southern state, but Faubus, he needed an issue. And there was, basically said, I'm going to stand in the schoolhouse door, we're going to stop the integration of Little Rock Central High. And he did. He stood there. He blocked them. He turned everybody away. Now, what he did, the city of Little Rock, actually a fairly progressive city, him going on the radio and saying this, when you see the protests, like all those people in that picture up there of Elizabeth Eckford, you see the young lady walking to school, it's sort of the gold-colored background next to Lee Harvey Oswald there. Most of the people there, those aren't even people from Little Rock. Those are the folks from out in the country, the hillbillies and stuff like that. They all came to town, and he created quite a stir. Okay, that young lady missed her ride to school. Actually, she didn't know they were all going to ride to school. They had agreed to ride to school together and be dropped off in front of the school. Her family didn't have a telephone, so she didn't get the message. So she had to walk through this screaming crowd to get to the school. Now, she had been trained. The civil right, the NAACP trained people to be non-reactive. Okay, so imagine walking down the street. You got these people. You've got these people walking straight down I mean, she's walking down the street and you got these people following her, yelling all kinds of things at her. She's completely surrounded by angry people. Okay? Now, think about it. Could you do that? And just like the racial slurs, all kinds of things, right there in your face. She just walks to school. She's wearing those dark glasses. Those show you can't show. She can't show fear. She can't show weakness. I'll get you in just a second, okay? But the thing is, she walks and because the focus is nonviolent civil disobedience. Now she's just trying to go to school, okay? She is a senior in high school, walking there. You know, she's just wearing a dress. You know, just dressed normally, and you see the anger on those people's faces. Imagine walking that. She had to walk a block and a half like that. Okay? And also television camera following her. That may have been what saved her. It's that television camera. Okay? She ends up going. She's met that she can't go into school. There's another, if you watch the film on Eyes on the Prize, literally later after she's turned away, she's just sitting on a bus stop bench. People sitting all around yelling at her. And then a lady from the neighborhood just comes in and sort of takes her and because it's, again, these people weren't necessarily the people in Little Rock that were doing this. So this was a crazy situation. Now we know the president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, he does force the integration of Little Rock Central. Okay, the Little Rock 9, they do attend school. 8 of them do graduate. 1 of them does get expelled for dumping chili on somebody. But they also have a military policeman that escorts them from class to class. Okay, and that's how that happens. Okay, Bryce, you have... Yeah, okay. Do you have something?
Was Malcolm X alive during this time?
Yes, we'll get to him in just a second. Question?
Okay, so you said that the governor of Arkansas, he
Yeah.
tried to stop it. Okay, so Brown Board of Education, that was like...
It's a federal court order.
Yeah. So how he gonna stop it if it was for...
He was in violation of a federal court order, and the argument that a lot of these segregationists had was that this is a state's right and it's not in the Constitution, which is a true statement. Education is supposed to be under the states. However, the Supreme Court expanded the power of the federal government and said, no, equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment. Okay? So it changed our view. And that's what happens with judicial review. Basically, our policies change based on interpretation, and the Supreme Court provides that interpretation. That's why it's such a big deal when we have Supreme Court justices appointed and approved, that kind of thing. Now, so Little Rock 9, that was a big thing. They do integrate the schools. Of course, sadly, the next year, they close the schools in Little Rock. There's no public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas for 1958, 1959. They call it the missing year. There's a great... No, we can't do that. All right. So, you want to miss your senior year? All right. So, also in 1957, we have an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is formed. Okay? The SCLC is what? Actually, you'll see SCLC, you'll see that in your in the readings that you have to do for your state tests and things like that. They will abbreviate. There's a lot of abbreviation of organizations during the Civil Rights Movement, so you need to make sure you pay attention to that. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, we see that this is church-based, right? Southern Christian. This is actually formed by a group of 100 pastors, okay? And one of them, and the first president of this organization, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Okay? SCLC, okay, it's 100 pastors. And the reason they do this, okay, these pastors are essentially going to use their churches as a jumping off point for the Civil Rights Movement. They're going to focus on nonviolent civil disobedience.
Did this call church bonus?
Some later on. We'll get to that because that's more in the 60s, and we'll get there particularly tomorrow. Okay, nonviolent civil disobedience. Martin Luther King Jr. called it soul force. Okay, Now, nonviolence, that's pretty easy. Okay, it's going to be peaceful, whatever they do. Now, the civil disobedience, particularly what we're going to focus on with the SCLC, is they are going to go against the unjust segregation laws. So nonviolent civil disobedience, that would be if me, as a white man, maybe I go and drink from the colored water fountain. Guess what? In 9 southern states, I broke the law doing that. Did I violently attack the water fountain, rip it from the wall, and throw it out in the street? No. I just drank some water. But I broke the law. That's civil disobedience, right? That's going against what the law said. Okay? And that's what they supported. They supported groups like the Freedom Riders, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The sit-in movement, which we're about to talk about. Those kinds of things. Later on, you got the read-in. People would go to the segregated libraries and sit and read a book. Can you imagine getting arrested for going to the library to read a book? And in Jackson, Mississippi, the building's still there. I hope they do something with it. But that was a very big part of protest during the early 1960s, was the fact that the public library, the downtown public library, was segregated. African Americans couldn't go to that one. They had an African American library that was a quarter the size, and it got all the old books and that kind of thing. And so they had read-ins at that library, and it's a civil rights site. Unfortunately, the building is in disrepair because they replaced, they built a new library. But that's Soul Force, and Martin Luther King, that's sort of his brand of civil rights movement, is nonviolent civil disobedience. Now, he's influenced by other nonviolent civil disobeyers. Okay, there's some very prominent ones in world history. Okay, Jesse James, he's pretty violent, nonviolent. Okay, so very prominent, particularly close to this, was a guy named Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, do y'all remember the story of Mahatma Gandhi from world history? Okay, basically he got India its independence from Britain, but he did that through nonviolent civil disobedience, civil protest. He also went on hunger strikes and encouraged people to do that with him. It was nonviolent. Sadly, he ended up being murdered, but India got its independence. In American history, a great author of the 1840s was a guy named Henry David Thoreau. He actually wrote a book called Civil Disobedience. He refused to pay his taxes because those taxes supported a war that he did not agree with. Okay? So civil disobedience is about that. And of course, Martin Luther King and these other pastors, who is the leader for them if they are a Christian pastor? Jesus. Okay? Jesus did nonviolent civil disobedience, except that one time he was violent. If you know your Bible, you know the one time he was violent, when he made a whip and drove people out of the temple. But other than that, he just broke the rules that he didn't think were right. He didn't go, throw a Pharisee off a cliff or something like that. He just did it, okay? And so, basically, he may have wanted to throw a Pharisee off the cliff, but he didn't do it. All right, so nonviolent civil disobedience. And this is going to be Martin Luther King, the SCLC, and other groups. This is going to be their brand of protest for the civil rights movement. And later on, there's a little clash between these groups. Okay, so the SCLC still exists today, by the way. About 5 or 6 years ago, they actually had their convention in Memphis, the SCLC. All right, so nonviolent. Any questions about that? So now we're going to move up to 1960. Also, 1957, there was a Civil Rights Act passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 essentially it allowed the federal government to investigate voter registration. Okay? So now the federal government's going to take a look at voter registration. It's a slow process, but the Civil Rights Act of 1957, it's the first Civil Rights Act that's been passed since 1867 or so. And so that's a big deal. But it's overshadowed because it really doesn't do a ton to end discrimination. It does work at voting rights, though. Now we're going to skip ahead to 1960. 1960 was kind of a big year. You have a new group formed, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I know, say that 3 times fast. So we just call it SNCC, okay, the SNCC, all right? Okay, just looking at the name of that organization, we can see what their focus is. How are they going to protest? And what means are they going to use? Nonviolent, right? Who's this group made up of?
Students.
What kind of students? College students. It's made up of college students. Okay? Why not high school students? Y'all are too young right now. Right now, most of you are not registered to vote. Okay? Most of us are not registered to vote just yet. Also, you're minors. So it tended to be the college students. The college students, they were pretty aware and they were paying attention to what was going on. Now, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this is going to be a very, very important group. They are going to do sit-ins. Okay, the sit-ins. Okay? Now, basically what the sit-in is they would go into a segregated place. Particularly the sit-in movement, the biggest thing we see is lunch counters. And lunch counters are things that we don't really have anymore. And part of that, in the South at least, was because of the sit-ins. Department stores used to do what they could to keep you in that store all day. Why? You're going to buy more stuff, right? So they made it super convenient. Stores like particularly Woolworths, because that's where most of the sit-ins took place, they had a lunch counter in there. Think of like a little diner where you could pick up a hamburger or something like that. Probably get a milkshake. Just something so you could grab a meal and continue shopping. Okay? And generally these lunch counters, the food was fairly inexpensive, particularly at Woolworths, because that was kind of what they were known for. Well, Woolworths in the South had segregated lunch counters. Okay? That meant that if you're African American, you might be able to shop in the Woolworths store. In some cities, you couldn't even shop in that Woolworths. There had to be one in the colored part of town. But you might be able to shop in that store, but you could not sit on that lunch counter. Now, it wasn't necessarily state law, but it may have been city law that you couldn't do that. Okay? The very first sit-in was in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. We call it the Greensboro sit-in, okay? And actually, well, let me move something right quick. If you look over here in this corner of the room, let me move Jimmy Carter out of the way. Okay. That poster in the very corner, I know A. Philip Randolph might be in the way, that is an image of the Greensboro sit-in, okay? Basically, this sit-in went on for about 6 weeks. The nonviolent protests, they are going to go in, they're going to sit down and wait to be served. Okay? Well, the owners of Woolworths, they did not want to cause much stink there, and so they just ignored them. Now, what that did was that kept other people from sitting at that same counter, because then they would be breaking city ordinance. But think of it, the lunch counter was more like how many of you have been to Waffle House? Okay, you got the little counter, and then you got a few booths there. They're always little. Okay, but that's what it was. So business still continued. Okay. Well, this went on. Now, it did hurt business because they weren't able to fill those seats. It went on for about 6 weeks, and then finally, the Greensboro sit-in was a success. Okay. Now these young men, these were college students. They dressed nicely. Routinely, people would wear, like a sport coat even to go to college classes in the 60s. People dressed up. People would wear suits to go on airplanes and the bus and all that kind of stuff. So it was a little different. So you see, they're very clean cut. young men. They are sitting there peacefully. You might also see, I don't know in that picture, there's another picture where actually the people working at the lunch counter were African Americans. Well, no, the one in the very corner is the Greensboro sit-in. Okay. Now the sit-in movement is going to continue on. Okay. Now the one next to that picture is from 3 years later. That's 1963, and the one just to the right of that is actually a Woolworths in Jackson, Mississippi. Okay, and you do see that they are dumping things on those nonviolent protesters. Those protesters in Jackson, Mississippi, that's 1963, they are members of SNCC, and it's the chapter from a college called Tougaloo College. Anybody ever heard of Tougaloo College? It's a great little college. It's a private college down in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's a historically African-American school. Okay? It is a church-run school. I believe it's run by the Methodist Church, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? But the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had a chapter there. And if you look, the difference in that picture, look at the people who are sitting there with stuff poured on them in that second picture. What do you see? There is like you said, there is a white guy there. He is actually a pastor. He's one of the faculty of Tougaloo, and he's the sponsor of that SNCC chapter. It is a mixed group. Also, look at the age of the people who are doing the dumping of things. Now, there is one creepy old man in that picture, if you can see it. But most of them are high school students. Woolworths in Jackson, Mississippi was about 2 blocks from Central High School in Jackson, Mississippi. And they had open lunch hour. Woolworths was a place where you can go get you a 15-cent hamburger and a nickel Coca-Cola. So people would go down there and get a lunch. Well, just like today, not saying that today we get involved in racial stuff like this, but we do, if there's some action, we want to go see it, right? Okay, perhaps instead of avoiding where an altercation might be going on, what do? We flock to it because we want to show. So kind of the same thing happened there, okay? Most of those are college students. Now, the police do eventually arrive, and they make some arrests. Who gets arrested? The people sitting at the lunch counter for inciting a riot. And so it just shows the inequality of it. Now, the sit-in movement is going to go on. There are some more violent sit-ins. Now, this still isn't necessarily violent. They aren't beaten, but they are dumped. I mean, the ketchup, the milkshake, all that kind of stuff is dumped on. Now, do you see the African-American lady in that picture who is, you see there's like a drink machine sitting there, and she's got like a white stripe on her head? Yeah. Hey, that's a vanilla milkshake. That lady is very important. Her name is Ann Moody. Ann Moody is an author, and she wrote one of the best books on the civil rights movement in the state of Mississippi. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend it. It's called Coming of Age in Mississippi. She was born the daughter of a sharecropper. She actually went to college on a basketball scholarship, but she ends up finding herself in the middle of a lot of the things that occurred in Mississippi. And sadly, half of that book is about the county that I grew up in. And that's one of those books that mentions names, like I told you, people that I actually knew growing up. So, but the thing is, Coming of Age in Mississippi. So does everybody understand the sit-in movement? The Greensboro sit-in, very, very peaceful, but they increased in... Also, there's a difference between North Carolina and Mississippi, right? North Carolina is further north. They're more progressive. You get down to the deep south in Mississippi, obviously there's going to be a little different opinion about it. But the sit-ins, this was another example of nonviolent civil disobedience. Anybody have a question about any of those things? Okay. All right. Well, obviously 1960, who's elected president? Do you remember?
No, it was
Bush.
no,
John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, the civil rights president. Okay. So 1960, that's a win for the civil rights movement because now they have a president that's pushing for these things. And what did Kennedy promise? He promised a civil rights act that would outlaw discrimination in public places. Okay, now we're going to move to 1961. No, that's actually 63. So, 1961, the big thing in 1961 was something called the Freedom Riders. Unfortunately, that picture's covered up over there, but the Freedom Riders, okay? Basically, yeah, we'll talk about it. Y'all may, yes, there is. Well, are you talking about the writers or riders?
He might talk about the writers.
Freedom Writers is a really good movie too. But all right, but let's talk about the Freedom Riders. Okay, what the Freedom Riders were, this was a group that were going to test whether or not interstate buses were integrated and interstate bus facilities were integrated across the South. So basically they were going to get on a bus in Washington, D.C. and ride across the South. And when they got off the bus, if the waiting rooms were still marked white and colored, well, the whites were going to go into the colored waiting room and the black people were going to go into the white waiting room to test that court order. Okay? That's what the Freedom Riders were going to do. And they were going to do this through the summer. And the Freedom Riders, they're going to continue going until 1964. In 1961, we have a couple of violent altercations. Okay? The worst one is outside of Birmingham, Alabama. The buses, as they go deeper into the South, early on they don't have any problems. They just do it and no problems at all. But Alabama, they know, is a bit more segregated than other states. Well, they arrive in Birmingham, Alabama. And essentially, the bus station's completely deserted. And so they get off the bus, and all of a sudden, a crowd comes out, and they have, sticks and pipes. They're hitting the bus and everything. The bus driver gets afraid and just puts the bus in gear and gets out of town. Well, some of the mob people, they jump in their cars and follow the bus. And they're shooting at the tires and all sorts of stuff. Well, the bus gets down the road. They actually make it about 20 miles outside of Birmingham. There's a town called Anniston, Alabama, that's just east of Birmingham. If you drive to Atlanta, you go right through Anniston. But the bus couldn't go anymore. Enough of the tires had been blown out that it couldn't go anymore. So the bus comes to a stop. Okay. Well, the cars surround the bus, and some people hold the door of the bus shut while somebody throws a firebomb through the back window of the bus. The bus catches on fire. The people on the bus, they're able to force the door open. They're able to get off, and no one is hurt seriously in this. But this shows the violence that people are willing to do over where to sit on a bus. Okay? And that, if you've been to the Civil Rights Museum, there's the burned up bus in there. Okay? That's a Greyhound Cena Cruiser. And that's the kind of bus that this was. I don't know that that's the actual bus, but it is a bus like that. But that's Anniston, Alabama. Well, this is very violent. President Kennedy's concerned about this, and there's another violent outbreak. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. In Montgomery, Alabama, basically, bus station's completely deserted. Driver opens the door, still deserted. People exit the bus, still deserted. They're walking into the bus station, then all of a sudden, crowd runs and just beats them. No one is killed in this, but we do have some people that are seriously injured. In fact, one of those Freedom Riders was a pregnant lady, and luckily a car pulled up and just said, get in, and she jumped in, and luckily she was not, and neither was the baby, seriously injured. But this just shows that violence. It gets so bad that bus drivers refuse to drive buses that have Freedom Riders on it. And it comes down to John F. Kennedy having to order protection for buses crossing the state of Alabama. He calls up the National Guard, and those buses end up being escorted across the state of Alabama. But their goal, the Freedom Riders' goal, was Jackson, Mississippi, which was the most segregated city in the country at the time. And those Alabama National Guardsmen, they had to stop at the state line. I remember I've read books on this, and they said that they knew the state line of Mississippi was 5 miles away. You know, they started to pray on the bus. They started to sing on the bus because they knew. And then the last half mile, the little Jeeps with the National Guardsmen sort of turned off, and that bus continued. The way they wrote it, they said that bus continued into the unknown. Was, you know, sure, they pictured, you know, a roadblock or somebody's going to blow up the bus just as it crosses the state line, that kind of thing. Well, the bus stopped in Meridian. They did. They were not arrested, accosted in Meridian. Remember, their goal is Jackson, Mississippi. So they go into Jackson, Mississippi. There's a crowd there, but the police are holding back the crowd. They're still very concerned. The driver opens that door. Because, you know, in the old days, the buses had to park in like a parking lot, and then you had to walk to the bus station, right? It's not like a covered area or anything like that. So there was a crowd there. The police are holding them back. Driver opens the door. You know, what's that driver thinking?
He gonna die.
Hey, he had the drivers, they had to make a court order to make the drivers drive. He's not, you think he wanted that position right then? He's opening the door. Because get on the bus. Who's the first one there? You know, if somebody's coming out, I mean, you're stuck in that seat. Okay? Driver opens the door. People get off. Crowd's held back. Yeah, they're jeering and all that kind of stuff. The crowd is held back. They go into the bus station and do their thing. Now, they are arrested because they broke the state law, and the governor said, we are going to arrest them. But there was no mob violence against them like it was in Alabama. In fact, if you go to the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which if ever you get a chance to go to Jackson, Mississippi, go to the Civil Rights Museum. They have pictures, all the mug shots of all the freedom riders that were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. And there's hundreds of them. And actually, on certain days, I think it was Thursdays, one of those freedom riders that was arrested is there to tell you about it. And he'll tell you he was super mad. His friend dared him to go into the bus station while all this was going on. And he ended up having to go to Parchment Prison. And he was only like 14 years old. So it was some crazy. Now the freedom rides, they continue on. But remember, this is testing the integration order from the Supreme Court. And that's 1961. They run through 1964 when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, okay? The Freedom Riders. As you drive across Mississippi, we have a civil rights trail. There's historic markers for civil rights events that occurred in Mississippi. We actually have one in DeSoto County, right down on Highway 51, just south of Hernando. That's called the March Against Fear. And sadly, someone was shot right there. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But if you find yourself riding down Highway 51, take a drive south of Hernando and check out that civil rights marker. So, all right, so tonight I'm going to give you this sheet that is our homework sheet on civil rights movement. But also I do have a page of notes that's kind of, we went through the early stuff real quick, but I gave you a page of notes on that very early stuff, so you got that. So make sure you pay attention to that.